Welcome to the Wisdom of Jacob's Ladder. I'm your host, Jacob Cooper, best-selling author of Life After Breath and the Wisdom of Jacob's Ladder. For those of you who are new to my channel, we welcome you here. Please make sure to consider to hit that subscribe button as well as bell notification icon to stay up to date to interviews coming your way each and every week. Today's guest on the Wisdom of Jacob's Ladder is Jona Gevona. Jona, works with some of the most high prolific athletes and people who are at the top of their own fields, and she works in a way where she really maximizes the power of the mind-body practices really derived from her deep, Tibetan, training and roots. And she works, very closely, with a lot of the top tier performers in any given field to really understand, the power of the mind, the body, as well as bringing sensitivity to some of these sports fields, as well as the power of intuition and cohesion with a lot of these Eastern belief systems. So without further ado, we welcome Jona Gevona here on the Wisdom of Jacob's Ladder. Jona Gevona, thank you for being here as my honored guest on the Wisdom of Jacob's Ladder. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
It's good to have you. I know we certainly connected, through a mutual acquaintance, and I really admire a lot of your work for several reasons. Certainly, we will get into some of your work with some of the most high prolific athletes and, people in this world. But for viewers, who may not have heard of you or your work, could you maybe summarize a little bit about, some of the incredible, mind body work that you're doing? And it's just very innovative and ahead of its time. So maybe just share a little bit about that with my viewers.
Sure. So at this time, I'm a mental conditioning coach, and I work primarily with professional athletes, specifically NFL coaches and players.
Mm-hmm.
And as you know, these things don't happen overnight. So the evolution of my work, it's pretty innovative. I'm not following someone else's plan or another textbook. It is the culmination of, I call them intersection points in my life. And the first point would be that I was a highly sensitive kid, just very sensitive to other people's feelings, sensitive
Sure.
to sounds and textures in nature. That's intersection point one. And then the second piece is that I was invited to leave high school a year early, where somehow I ended up being a part of some of the earliest brain mapping research. So
Wow.
at a really young age, I got to see something that many people are just beginning to believe, and that is that there is a mind-body connection. So I saw it with my own eyes in a laboratory when I was about 17 or 18 years old. And then the next intersection point is that I ended up at a university meeting someone who's my mentor, John McCransky, and he is a Tibetan Lama. And I began studying and practicing Tibetan Buddhism and Tibetan mind training practices. And while that was going on, another influential woman who is a neuroscientist, and her name is Lisa Feldman Barrett. And she went on to develop something called the theory of constructed emotion. And so all of these things together, life experiences, somehow I end up here in this very moment.
Wow. On a personal basis, it seems, you were maybe an HSP, or for my viewers, highly sensitive person, or an empath, but seeing, all these things in front of your eyes, that, what did that do for you? Just, I'm just kind of curious, because it might have been maybe a struggle to know, hey, I'm very sensitive. And did this kind of give you an idea as to why, was it tangible for you?
So I feel like you can relate.
Mm.
I've watched a few of your interviews, and I wonder if you can relate to this part too. So at first there was a sense of loneliness, like, why aren't people seeing what I see or getting what I get in this particular moment,
Right.
like as a kid and through high school. It still happens today, but now I better understand it. So there's kind of a feeling of like confusion and loneliness. And that for me came from what I call energetic incongruencies. So maybe someone was saying something that didn't match the feeling I was getting from them, or doing something that didn't match. So that part was confusing. And then it was validating to see this mind-body connection thing in a laboratory, because in high school I had become kind of sick because of some stress, like physically sick. And of course, doctors at that time, still today, many doctors will say, oh, it's just psychosomatic, or we don't see anything going on, so you're okay.
Right.
And I saw this mind-body connection in the lab, but I was working with a professor, and then there was an assistant in the lab with us. And then there were a handful of people in Australia who were doing similar research. So, less than 10 people in the world saw what I saw and could understand it. And so when I tried to talk about it, I felt so excited, like, oh, everyone, like this, you will believe this. Like, with our minds, what we're thinking about can actually influence our neural response to pain. And like almost to this day, maybe up until 5 years ago, people just sort of, it would go over their head, or they didn't want to hear what I had to say. So it kind of went back to a place of confusion, sadly. So yeah, I'm grateful for the journey, but I think for many highly sensitive people, there's a kind of a loneliness that we experience, unless we're around other highly sensitives.
Without a doubt, but there may be a double-edged sword to that loneliness, in a sense that we're different, and that's not a bad thing. And we're meant to make a difference. We're meant to generate a current instead of being a leaf in it. And certainly, you're generating a current in a lot of interesting fields, to break this in. But I'm just kind of curious for my viewers. When you said you were in a lab and you were 1 out of 10 people, and I don't know if this like highly classified stuff here, but could you describe like what exactly you saw that just gave you this maybe aha moment, or this just like, wow, this is real. This mind body thing is not, woo, it is, authentic.
Absolutely. And it's not like highly classified.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So this was in around the 1995, I think. So maybe like summer of 95 when I was in the lab. Yeah. And so Dr. Dowman, Robert Dowman, was the professor and scientist on the project. And what we were doing is using, we had participants, 2 groups of participants, all were hooked up to a way for us to watch their neural activity and the brain activity, and then also a large nerve that runs along the leg. And we would stimulate them, shock them, and we would find out like, okay, at what level is this shock painful for you? And surprising to me, like I thought the level of pain was kind of the same for everyone, but it kind of depends on how close neural receptors are to the skin. And there's like a wide variance there. So we'd find for each individual, like where their pain point was, and then sat them in front of a screen, like a TV screen.
Sure.
And there was a horizontal line going across the screen. And with each stimulation, each minor shock, a dot would appear after the stimulation. A dot would appear on the screen. And we told the participants, your job, as best you can, we didn't tell them how, is to keep the dots above the line. And as I said, there were 2 groups. So one group would be successful in keeping the dot above the line if they decreased their neural response to the pain. So in the other room, we're watching on other TV screens the action potential of that nerve firing. So like it's like a bell curve kind of thing. And so the group that was meant to keep would be successful if they decreased their neural response to pain. The dots would be above the line. They did like okay at it. But the group who was the opposite, whose job it was, or they would have been successful if they kept the dots above the line by increasing their response to pain, they were failing. But they were failing so hard that they kept trying harder and harder to get that darn dot above the line. But what it was doing is it was driving it lower and lower and getting it consistently lower and lower and lower. And I think it was my sensitivity. I never really talked to anyone about this, so I'm glad. Thanks for asking. How many years later I get to go back and do this? I saw them in there, and it was my job to like hook them up and do the whole thing. And I could see that they were getting frustrated, this second group. And I said, well, like, what is it that you think you're supposed to be doing? And they said, consistently, I think there were maybe 15 or so participants in each group. Well, I'm supposed to be reducing my pain, aren't I? And so a light bulb went on for me. Like, they were actually highly successful, even more successful than the first group, at accomplishing what they thought the study was about. And then I asked them, I said, okay, well, I'm curious, what are you thinking about? Because you're all like, I didn't say this, but I'm like, you're really good you're like nailing this. And this part is so incredible to me, because years later it was validated through practices in Tibetan Buddhism. And now like there's behavioral psychology that backs this. But they just, on their own, individuals who were not talking to each other. This was in Potsdam, New York, where there were beautiful sunsets. Most of the kids, the college kids who were participants, said that they would think about a sunset or something that was peaceful, a place that was peaceful for them.
Yes.
And so this was the work. And so obviously what we see here is that someone's thoughts, in particular, when we think of a place that's pleasant or peaceful, we can change how our body is responding to pain and other things as well. And it's not a sense that I'm just not feeling this pain as much. The body literally isn't processing it as painful. It's not doing the damage. So if you think about like somehow like burning the skin without it like hurting the person, not burning the skin, but
talking about maybe like the fire walk that Tony Robbins does, or just something like that. Yeah.
I wonder about that.
Right. But it seems like it was a very powerful opener to you, just to see how visceral and real our thoughts are, our mind is, and how much of a correlationship it is with our own lives and our own body, from what I'm gathering.
Definitely. And that was a piece where I thought to myself, there's, I don't mean to put down doctors, but doctors who are saying, oh, it's, there's no connection between the mind. This was back then. And today it's still a sense that it's not typically a holistic view, or they're not trained holistically to understand the interdependence of the ecosystem of the individual. But then also, what about the interdependence of us as beings, even on this call right now, or the interdependence of the environment around us, we're all influencing each other. And for me, that's the part that seems to be a thread in how I experience the world, is a deep sensitivity to that interdependence. I wonder, is that how it feels to you?
Yeah, I'm just wondering, for us, I think we understand this, but for maybe, the world watching or people watching, how do you feel people are able to move that needle to really experience this type of interconnectivity? And what do you feel are some of the barriers that's present with this undeniable connectivity, that's really been validated through countless studies, so I'm just wondering, like, what do you feel is the biggest barrier to this? Because we could be a much better place. The world will look a lot different if we saw this web that we're all a part of and it was something tangible.
I think I hear two questions in what you just asked. And one is, what's the barrier? And then also, how could we get a better sense of this interconnectedness? I think the barrier is our cultural conditioning, and our dominant culture that we've been raised in values a kind of hyper independence. We are autonomous beings, and a lot of this is really appealing. Like, I am responsible for my own success in life, like, if it's a part of the American dream, it's like baked into that. And I think that it's really difficult if we start to challenge that, because not only has that been maybe how I've been driving my life, but also intergenerationally, that's how my family has lived their life. So if I say that's not true, in a way, it invalidates not only my own way of living, but my loved ones who taught me how to live. So I think it's really deep. The barriers are quite deep, and often like it's just difficult for people to consider or to face. And then it's kind of like, well, why would I? Like, this just seems like a road I don't want to go down. And then feel people kind of put the brakes on, like, I don't want to have this conversation. But on the other side of that, and I mean, we see it's true in societies that do not have this hyper independence as a value, there's greater cooperation and caring for each other in ways that are really nourishing. And at this time in our history, our choices about where we prioritize this independent lifestyle are directly related to consumerism and damage on the environment. So then there's that piece too, like, okay, what if we let go of this idea that, you know, my life is not impacting other people, that I get to kind of do whatever I want, then I might make different choices about how I consume or what I consume. And that could make a big impact on our environment, our shared environment. But we also see that these societies that have been living like this, they have not been making the impact on the environment that we have been. So we can almost use them as a model. And oftentimes we call these like third world countries, you know, and we have this sense of hierarchy, like, well, they're just not as sophisticated. I kind of wonder, maybe we have that wrong. Maybe there's a really deep sophistication in accepting our interdependence and prioritizing what I might call like a relational nourishment, like nourishing through relationship rather than nourishing ourselves through consumerism of like material things.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's kind of like an ecosystem versus ecosystem thing. And I think that's, you know, a lot of societies are governed by, you know, sensitivity to the ecosystem, where others are more driven by the ego system. And that's, you know, it's causing a lot of schisms from what it seems, from what you're saying, and from what we gather. Yeah.
I think that's a beautiful way to put it.
Yeah. Speaking of which, you know, an interesting segue to the work that, you know, you do, because, you know, we've seen coaching on a professional level, you know, shift. I know, you know, my good friend that I had on, George Mumford, was, you know, very heavily involved on, you know, Phil Jackson, aka the Zen Masters team. But before that, you know, you'd watch movies, you'd see NFL coaches, they would be quite aggressive, you know, toxic masculinity. They just kind of grab you by the helmet, and that was the way that they, you know, did things. And there seems to be this new wave of coaches in coaching that we see. But I'm just wondering, how have you able to incorporate this cooperation into fierce competition with some of your athletes? Like, how have you been able to infiltrate? Because they seem to be quite contradictory. You know, are they, or how have you been able to infuse the two?
I don't think they are contradictory. I think that there's like an old paradigm that says, yes, that, you know, kind of cooperating or thinking about anyone else's feelings or needs would reduce the level of competition. But I will suggest quite the opposite. And I have evidence to back this up. And I love having evidence to back things up. So the first piece, so I work at this time with people who are play sports that are team sports. And this wasn't, you know, my intention. It was kind of an accident how I got into working with NFL folks. But now I see kind of the like divine order of things. And if we think about what's going on in football, each individual athlete certainly needs to be focused on what they're doing and aware of what they're doing. But they also need to be highly attuned to what everyone else on the field is doing to some extent. And this is what makes them spectacular. So here's an example. I was recently talking to a wide receiver about this like it's my theory of sensitivity, and that people who are highly sensitive are like, I mean that in a way of like hyper aware of surroundings. Like they'll feel the wind, maybe not in a way that they could vocalize, but their bodies are picking up on it and they're making decisions based on what they're sensing. And this wide receiver said that the play was such that the ball wasn't supposed to go to him on that play, but something told him to turn. He was supposed to run down the field, and something told him to turn and look. And I think it was the quarterback had made a decision to just change things up, and he looked at just the right time and was there to make this spectacular catch and ultimately a touchdown. So that kind of attunement to everyone on the field with varying levels of like connection to everyone on the field, because we don't want to be equally attuned to everyone. There's some that we need to be more attuned to in that moment and prioritize, right? So this is a kind of like, I mean, this is major Spidey senses. This is like Jedi level, awareness and tuning in is what can make these athletes make decisions in the moment that create greatness at the highest level of play. Now, we don't see this probably in like, I don't know, a pickup game with a bunch of people my age, in the park. I mean, maybe on some level, but we really know like there's like kind of like a magnificence that comes out at these like the highest levels of play. So that's one piece. And then the next piece is, pardon me, there's something called the motivational theory. And I won't go into all of the details of it, but there are two types of motivation, and it's a spectrum. And on one end of the spectrum, we have intrinsic motivation, or motivation that comes from within. And then on the other end of the spectrum, we have extrinsic motivation that comes from someone else, like a coach yelling at us. And it turns out that a coach yelling at us is far less motivating than a kind of intrinsic motivation. It's less sustainable, and it can cause other feelings that actually get in the way of the intrinsic motivation. So for all people, but I'm working with professional athletes who've been playing this sport for 20 years or so, and we're talking longevity, right? It has to come from within. And so a coach who nourishes each athlete by seeing into their deep dignity, worth, and potential is going to be far more motivating, because it's activating that intrinsic motivation. Like, I know you have the potential to do this inside of you. I know you can do better. What corrections do you need? What guidance do you need? And I find that these men are really, they just want to know, how can I do better? They all want to be great at this. They all want to do, their best beyond the best they've ever seen. And so they just want some help, like, you can see me from the outside. What do you see that I don't see? Several coaches. I mean, I have one in mind. I can't offer his name because I work with him privately, but
confidentiality.
He epitomizes this, and the connection that he makes with his players really kind of upsets and surprises some of the older generation of coaches who came up with that, like motivating through fear or yelling or tearing someone down. And it's been fun to watch over the past 2 to 3 years that I've been working with him, his success and the confusion on the part of the old paradigm.
Right.
Yeah.
It's almost backwards from what you're saying, where in a sense, sensitivity and softness is really strength and productive, versus just kind of yelling and screaming and getting all rough, shuts down the athlete. And certainly we think of parents, right? We look at kids who might have unfortunately been physically or verbally abused or yell at. They tend to shut down. The brains don't work as productively, and it leads to a lot of autoimmune complications potentially throughout life. So it's just so damaging how that can be. But then that comes with a lot of your awareness, the sensitivity. My question for you is, we spoke a little bit about before, this kind of intergenerational pattern that some people have. And so certainly, if you're growing up playing a sport like football, you grow up with that mentality, or maybe you have a parent who, is yelling at you at the stands nonstop, or you just, one of these frat boys, whatever, and then all of a sudden, you or some of these other new wave of coaches comes by and talks about this stuff. Like, are there like skeptics that you have to deal with? Is everyone bought in, and is there like a sell that you do that might maybe move the needle, of that person who's accustomed to a totally, different spectrum of approach?
Hmm. There are certainly people who doubt
Hmm.
my approach. They doubt the need even for a mental conditioning coach. In fact, this year I was at the combine, and after working with clients, I decided to go and have a glass of wine at the bar in the downstairs of my hotel, and ended up sitting next to someone I did not realize was he's a Hall of Famer.
Wow.
He's now um, in a leadership role at a team. He is very well respected, and he asked, what I was doing at the combine, and I told him that I was helping to prepare draft prospects
Hmm.
for the combine, and I was there supporting them. And he had had a couple of glasses of wine, which many people do at the combine, and he insisted that there was really no need for this. That it just comes down to how good someone is, and if someone needs this kind of help, then they must not be a very good player at all.
A skeptic, yeah.
Yeah. And
Hmm.
he's speaking from his own experience,
Yeah.
like, hey, I was good enough. I didn't need it.
Right.
Anyone who needs this, they probably shouldn't be in the room.
Hmm.
And so for people like that, I don't try to change their mind. I really have, in my maturity, have learned to embrace the value of diversity across the board, right? Like, diversity in nature helps us all to thrive.
Hmm.
Diversity in rooms of humans helps us to come up with better ideas and more equitable ideas. And so I believe that this diversity amongst athletes and points of view is also probably valuable. Like, not everyone needs to buy into my approach, but the ones who do, there's usually an instant connection. So another example, just might have even been earlier the same night, I was waiting for an athlete I had worked with to finish his workouts,
Hmm.
kind of in this area, and people who are there are people who are like kind of fans who are there, and then folks who are working are usually recognizable by, like, what they're wearing or whatever. And
Hmm.
someone I did not know was walking by, and he came over to introduce himself. He was a coach, and there's just this kind of, it's a networking, and people kind of know each other, right? And
Hmm.
he asked what I did, and immediately he expressed his gratitude for the work that I'm doing, and shared personal experiences of how it has helped him as a
Hmm.
coach to be a better coach, and therefore helped his players to be better players.
Yeah.
So,
But it's no matter what you do. I was listening to Dr. Wayne Dyer speak about, the late Dr. Wayne Dyer, and he said, no matter what you do, no matter what you say, there's will be always someone who like comes back with like, oh my God, that doesn't make sense, and someone who buys in, and it's impossible to satisfy everyone. Everyone has a different spectrum of expectations and worldviews. But it seems like from what I'm finding, people who want to achieve greatness are open to almost anything.
mm,
Like,
mm.
and they are obsessed with doing everything and anything under the sun to get them to that next level. So I'm sure you're finding that too, where people who are hungry, people who are motivated, are also open to do almost anything, to get themselves to those new levels of the next level of performance.
I certainly find that. And when I find people like that, to me, that's really exciting.
Yeah.
Um, because I do believe that we have a limitless kind of potential.
Mm.
And so then to be, onboarded and helping someone to get there, that's thrilling to me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
When there's a buy-in and there's an excitement and enthusiasm, for working with you, I think that's great. Now you mentioned, also, you're an HSP or an empath as well, and sometimes that may come with a gift of intuition or just having insight. Like, is that something that you connect with? in your professional or personal life? Intuition, is that a skill that you utilize with some of the people that come into your work?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I would almost say that I've thought a lot about this.
Mm,
Um, I have some of the qualities of being a highly sensitive person.
mm,
I don't know how good of an empath I am.
mm,
Like I can sense textures.
mm.
I feel the world in textures, and I feel other
Okay.
like beings and objects in textures. And I had really the like incredible experience of working in treatment for a while,
Mm,
um, and I was doing energy healing with clients who were at residential treatment.
mm,
And so I didn't see their cases or their files. I was just in silence feeling
mm,
their energy. And then I was going so often and the clients really liked it. And so sometimes their therapist would say, what are you like feeling or what's going on? And then we might talk about the client's situation. And I discovered that there are certain like textures or patterns of
mm,
like vibration or energy that correlate to particular experiences. So
mm,
that was kind of amazing. So it's more like that. Like I don't necessarily know what someone's feel like emotions or feelings are. I feel like I'm
mm.
actually probably not very good at that. Like if it's a
Okay.
spectrum, like I don't get that right most of the time. But this like the texture of energy, I am like elite at.
Mm,
And so the intuitive piece,
mm,
um, I mean, you too, right? It's like it's how I
mm,
navigate the world. It's been a part of who I have been ever since I was a little girl. There's almost, I think, in the evolution of living as an intuitive person,
mm,
I think that there's a kind of a fear of turning it off. So when we start to
mm,
work with like energetic boundaries and maybe like not being overwhelmed by all the
mm,
information that we're getting, and we're like, okay, maybe I should like work with this, not always be open and on. There's a
mm,
fear that comes up. Well, how will I? That's like taking away my vision and asking me to
mm.
walk through the grocery store. Like, how am I going to do
Right,
that?
right, right, right.
So I've certainly learned to like uh, open and close it, like an
Mm,
aperture as needed.
mhm,
And so when working with clients or when
mm,
appropriate, it's kind of amazing
mm,
what I can notice. And oftentimes, what's fun is my football knowledge is probably less than many people who are football fans, right? Like,
right, right. Which may allow a lot more objectivity, in what you're doing, and just curiosity, and just looking at this through totally, like I'm just dropped off from God knows where, I don't know what's going on, but we're able to just look at this through those childlike wonder and curiosity. And I'm sure these athletes probably appreciate that, because they're just so used to like everyone knowing who they are, everything about them, and you're looking at them like, I don't know, it's like very curious and open, and that probably allows them to be more comfortable in your space, possibly. You know.
I think so. And I think that it opens up, um, then it's coming from a place of curiosity. So I was sitting across from one player who's an offensive lineman. We're
Mm,
having an in-person session. And as he was talking, let me think of how it was. It was his left shoulder. And I just said, well, what's going on with your left shoulder, the
mm,
left side of your body? I just feel so much weakness there. And that related to a struggle that he was having with a particular play. And that's what he was talking about in the moment that I felt
wow.
that.
See.
And I did not know the play, right?
Mm.
So there's a kind of what would we call that, Jacob? I don't know what to call that, but a kind of
A gift, a superpower, but just maybe you're empathing what he was feeling, or just kind of felt intuited, potentially. But yeah, I mean, it's pretty cool when those things happen, where we just feel something and it's right in front of us. There's evidence in front of it, and just reminds us of this interconnected web that we're all a part of, and it's pretty cool when that does, we do get those validations. I know, Phil Jackson was able to utilize a lot of his background with the Lakota Native Americans and just this concept of interdependency and how everyone is interconnected, and he would have basketball practices with the lights off, and he would just be doing a lot of stuff. And Michael Jordan was like, what is this man doing? And then eventually, there was buy-in because there was this connectivity. Is that a little bit about not necessarily what Phil's doing, but just your spiritual principles of this interconnectivity? Are you trying, in a way, not trying, but are you able to see the benefit of that working in the sports field? Is that what we're trying to do with just this web that people are connected? And once they're connected, does that also, would you say, promote more intuition as well too on the field?
I think that my initial tool when I first started working with these athletes, I was brought in as a meditation teacher to do like straight up helping them with focus. Although the type of meditation that I teach is very similar to what George Mumford has practiced and taught. So it's not about really like focusing hard on something. There's a kind of open awareness that is more the emphasis. But this happens first. We have to learn to work with the mind a bit to be able to be free. So I think of it as the way that improv people work. Like there's a lot of like study and practice about what makes a joke prior to being able to go out there and freestyle, or even a musician, right? So we have to learn the technique or the practice or kind of like the rules of things. And then once we have that really mastered, then we can open up into improv or freestyling or open awareness. So that's where I kind of thought it was, that's what I thought the juice was in the beginning, when I was getting really good results and people were observing me. I believe it's still that. However, I think there's another piece that I know happens with George as well, because I've been in his presence before. And so speaking from the lineage of Tibetan Buddhism that I have studied and practiced, and I've authorized to be a teacher of some of these practices. At a certain point, I mean, it's kind of like what I was describing with the trajectory of someone who gets to the point of improv. Once we, as a practitioner, have stabilized in the practices enough, then our very presence influences the people around us. And what the presence is it's being in this awareness of, maybe we could call it truth, like how things really are. And when we're grounded in that and present in that, then other people just sort of start to feel that and realize that about themselves. So these days in my practices, it's also kind of funny because, like the coach I mentioned, where people don't quite understand what he's doing to be so connected. I could be teaching meditation, or I could just be talking to someone, and it's getting this result of awakening within the person. Not just a spiritual awakening, but like a kind of a liberation from what's been holding them back.
Yeah, no, it's very innovative, and I'm sure it's leading to a lot of this different paradigm as more and more people are buying in, to this practice. Now, you also mentioned there's a strong influence in your life, in your work in Tibetan Buddhism. For you, like, what are some of the principles that stick out the most in your own personal, professional life that you try to really connect to, in your everyday kind of waking state that stand out to you?
I would say this piece of interconnectedness I've been working with this since I was introduced to Tibetan Buddhism, like formally working with this. I felt it as a little kid in nature. Like I felt the interconnectedness, but then I had the framework and words for it and other people to talk about it with.
Right.
I met Lama John in my early 20s. So that kind of like truth, it's so resonant for me. Like it aligns with how I view things. It doesn't take effort for me to be experiencing the world in that way. In fact, it takes effort for me not to experience interdependence, right? Like to try to step out of that is very challenging. So that's the first part. And so how that shows up when working with a client is I'm aware of how much I'm unaware of that's going on in their life or influencing how they are showing up in that particular moment. Right? Like just everything. Like what's the environment in their home? What's the environment in their neighborhood? What's the environment on the team, in the locker room? And these are all things that like could not be described in a session by talking about it, right? So I hold this kind of openness to there might be something going on that we're not going to name in this session, and that's okay, right? Like, and then another piece, which is I forget sometimes, and I work at remembering. And the way that I work at remembering is by doing the practices, daily and throughout the day. And that is remembering that essentially I am loved, and so is everybody else. And a lot of times on my Instagram stories, I'll post a reminder, like just a reminder, people you don't even know are praying for you right now. And for those people who are not religious, I don't think you have to be religious. There could be a sense that even like the sun, in a way, is caring for you right now. The planet is holding you, like literally the ground is holding you right now. And remembering this, and then practicing being an extension of that care. So to care in the ways that I have been cared for, to then care for others, like it being a tutorial for me of like that is how to live, to be an extension of this care.
Yeah, and I know you mentioned, and I have one of my teachers' names, Suzanne Giesenman. She speaks about BS, which in our language you think of it something else, but for her, it stands as belief systems. And I know you mentioned a lot of the cultural influences on our worldviews and how we see things, but it's very profound that you're bringing this concept up because certainly in our world we're taught, hey, in order to get love, you need to do something. There's a transaction in order for you to have this. And it seems from what you're saying within yourself and maybe some of these athletes that regardless of what happens, you could still have this degree of radical acceptance of your inner being, regardless of whatever the doing is. And that's profound, because there's such an instability. I'm sure in the athletes that you work with are high performers where one day you'll be a hero, the next day you'll be a zero, and people are like yo-yos. And it's no wonder why there's such a mental health crisis, not only that, but in our world, because there's just this unstable sense of self-validation and self-acceptance, that's constantly being edited and changed minute to minute, you know. It's profound.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm wondering for you, like doing this work, like everyone I think has a why behind, a lot of what they do. For you, what would you describe that why? Is that little girl who maybe wasn't understood, who now kind of connects to this and sees this as real and wants to share it to people who might be like that little girl? Or what would you say maybe is your reason for being brave, getting this out there and kind of breaking through a lot of industries with this stuff?
It is in many ways that little girl.
Mm,
That wasn't always how I would describe it. When I was making my first communion, prior to, all the Catholics out there will remember this. So before you make your first communion, you make your first penance, and that is the first time you go to confession. And so you have to learn about confession before you
right.
do communion. And I mean, I don't know how old we are at that point. We're like 6 years old, maybe. I don't know. And I remember being told about like sin, and you have to go and remember all your sins and confess them. And I didn't have a problem confessing them. I was concerned about remembering all of my sins. So I went to my dad and I said, Dad, does this mean that every like bad thought, every time I get annoyed with my older brother, like I have to remember how am I going to remember every time I get annoyed with him? To this day, my brother's my best friend, but as a little kid, you annoy each other. And my dad's amazing. And I'll never forget, he paused and he thought, and he said, Jona, God gives everyone gifts. And it's a sin when you don't use those gifts. So it's your job to figure out what your gifts are and to use them. So that's been my North Star in my life. And now that I'm my age, I can look back and say, oh, that little girl was meant to be a voice for the other highly sensitives, to
Mhm.
encourage the gifted ones to keep going, to be weird, to be different, to
Mm,
push beyond where other people might be comfortable you
mm,
are going. And to also recognize that because someone is maybe gifted, that often that comes with being independent. And so sometimes we we miss out on learning things that other people have to learn along the way, and then we find ourselves like unaware that we don't have some basic skills that we need. We also don't know how to
mhm,
ask for help. So I really see
mm.
my now as I'm older, uh, recognizing that and helping those folks.
Yeah. Well, it's like that Picasso quote where the purpose of life is to find your gift and the meaning of it is to give it away.
Yeah.
And it seems for you, you really are hitting that on all cylinders. Where you found this. It's not maybe there was a time where it may or may not have felt like a curse, but through information, through awareness, through a lot of study and research, you're recognizing that this is real and true and valid, and it allowed you to really see this as a gift. And it's really inspired you to really, like you said, you were just one of those few people who saw this study at this time. And once you kind of see that, you just want to go up to everyone and share it with the world. And I think you're doing it with people who are meant to be in your path and people who are open for it at this point. So I think that's wonderful.
I received that. Thanks for naming that and seeing that.
Yeah, no, that's a beautiful thing. 'Cause people ask, what is a gift? And I think a gift comes with meaning. I mean, there's that finding it, but it's not just to hold on to it. It's really to share that. To be. I think people really need to tune into their light, recognize that light, and understand. Hey, it's my job to shine this to the world, not just to have it privately or whatever. Do my own light show. So, yeah. Now, one of my final questions is, um, how do you work with a lot of these high performing people that you work with who want to have change? Like, what do you feel are some of the best steps? Because I think, at least for me, when I work with a lot of people, they try to do a lot at once, and a lot of like
Mm.
these big steps at once. Like, what is your approach with people that come your way who want that big result? But, you know, are you able to find a way that gets them, that result in a more productive way?
I wonder if we have the same answer to this question, and that's
Mm,
um, the power of baby steps and
mm,
consistency and discipline. Like
mm,
surprising how we want to, as humans, we just want to jump beyond the basics to some like incredible hack or something. And
mm.
um, one mentor that I mentioned, I call her Professor Barrett. That's her name when I knew her. Lisa Feldman Barrett. She has a quote that's something like, people want to do all this like Jedi training or something when really all they need is
Right.
a good night's sleep. So with one of my clients, I try to look at the basics. Like, are you getting the right hydration? Are you getting enough sleep? Are you getting the right nutrition? Do you
Mm,
have a schedule in place so that you're meditating or praying
mm,
regularly? It's boring. It's really
mm,
boring to be consistent, but that's how we get traction. And and then one day we look back and we're like, holy cow,
mm.
I'm about to be a Pro Bowler or whatever the
Right.
big goal is. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I heard, former President Obama give an analogy, about politics and football, where he said, politics is kind of like football, where it's like it's boring. You're just, getting the ball, 3 yard gain, 3 yard gain, and then eventually, you break through. And I think that's true of life, where at times, there could be this mundane element or it gets dry, but stay in the field, have a consistent approach, and eventually, when you're tuned in, those big plays will happen. But don't try to force them. You just have to stay in the present. But is there an approach, to you that at least values the journey versus the end game? Because I think a lot of people are very focused on results. So can you talk about maybe that dichotomy of the journey mode versus just this end game result mode, and how the two could maybe work with each other, work against each other, with the people that you come across?
yeah, I find myself in a results business,
Mm-hmm.
like week
Yeah.
to week results, and
Mm-hmm.
the stakes are really high. Um, so I have to be aware of results. And I like that, the scientist in me likes evidence, and not because I want to be right necessarily, but I like to make adjustments to like move closer towards precision. My brain really likes that kind of thing. So I think of it as setting our targets where we want to go in life, and then reverse engineering how am I going to get there, coming up with a really solid plan. But just like any explorer, if we're doing something no one else has ever done before, then we might, our best guess right now, we may find, okay, we need to make some adjustments, a mile into this journey. So we have a kind of openness along the way to make adjustments when necessary. But I really think about it as, it's like I'm an explorer. I have to have some flexibility, but I have to be diligent and honest. Getting real is something that I emphasize with all of my clients. Like, just like a scientist needs to be really honest with the data. Otherwise, what's the point? Be really honest about what's going on in your life and get honest feedback from people, because sometimes we don't always see ourselves very clearly.
Oh yeah, I mean, you have to be real, you have to be raw, you have to be honest, and sometimes we could all be a legend in our own minds, but we have to really look at what is versus maybe how we may be missing things. Is joy a part of the journey to success too? Would you say that if you're in a state of joy, that's helpful? Because a lot of people, when they're trying, to have embark on a journey, they're miserable the whole time, and I'm wondering if that is counterproductive. Like, is an emotional heightened state, helpful, for achievement? Would you say?
Hmm. That's a good question. I mean, there's a couple ways to think about this, but I'll use one example. So I've been working closely with someone, a young player who is up for the draft this year, and he's had some incredible achievements along the way. And we were talking about like celebration and like how do you celebrate, because the evidence is that people who are high achievers tend not to celebrate their wins along the way to the big goal, and that
It's
this can
never it's
result.
never enough. Yeah.
Yes. So it can result in burnout. I mean, the thing that drives the high achiever to go more than the distance, right? More than the distance that's necessary, is that voice inside of them that's saying, not good enough, never enough, but don't you want
Mhm,
more? So on the one hand, that voice is really, really helpful. But in the trajectory of like following through to goals, there's often a dip in motivation that happens about a third to 2/3 of the way through. It starts to get boring and monotonous, and we may not want to do it. So the antidote to that is creating mile markers along the way that are like mini goals before the big goal, and doing something to recognize it, to have that experience of joy, which is priming the body to want more of that. I want to get to the next mile marker. It's not just the big one. And then that can be fueling us. So it makes a lot of sense to celebrate the wins along the way. However, it's deeply challenging for someone who's a high achiever, because the
mhm,
thing that works for them is that contrary voice.
mhm,
So my suggestion for people who might be able to relate to this is celebration. And I joke about this. I'm like, it doesn't look like taking your pants off and running outside. I don't know why anyone would celebrate like that, but like we see this, I don't know, right? Like it's not like that. Often for the like super high achiever who has these big goals, who's intrinsically motivated, it's a deeply personal experience. And so the celebration could also be deeply personal. So it could
mhm,
be, just like a quiet evening to yourself, or going to a park and sitting there and in a way like rewarding yourself with a night of just sitting and being with you and
mhm,
honoring you. After all, you're the only one that was there every step. We all have people who help us along the way, but like you are the only one who knows all the days that you didn't want to wake up and do the workout, all the days that maybe you were in a little bit of pain or you felt sad. And so you kind of look at yourself through your higher self's eyes, maybe, and honor the self that was doing all of that work. So I think that's what the celebration could look like.
Mm. And that's really congruent with a lot of your work of compassion, sensitivity, and certainly within a lot of the Tibetan teachings as well too, how significant that self-compassion is and that self sensitivity is. Even especially to those people who are constantly chasing, they're never good enough, and to be able to give themselves that permission to smell the roses, to be in the moment, and to recognize the magnitude of it. I always say with my clients, like, what is it worth it if you're not finding joy, if you're not enjoying it, and it's just evasiveness, or just trying to find something vicariously through a victory that bypasses this ability to embrace who you are.
Mhm.
So yeah,
Mhm.
there's a lot of avoidance of self-acceptance through achievement sometimes, or through pleasing of other people. And I think if people were to learn how to sit with themselves, recognizing that they have all that they need, they are perfect just as they are. Things don't become a need, but rather an expression, of that spark within. So yeah, yeah. Well, you certainly unpacked a lot within our brief time here. Is there anything else that is coming to your mind? Any last messages that you feel a viewer could hear right now? During this juncture, with that brilliant intuitive side of yourself that I know is very well connected at this time.
I've been wondering why I feel this urge to name spiritual benefactors. And then it just occurred to me that's because this is probably largely what motivates this podcast in the first place and your work. So, um, spiritual benefactors is a framework that I learned from Tibetan Buddhism. And these are people who, or beings, or nature, who have loved us unconditionally and perhaps from afar, like maybe we've never met them. And so within this constellation of our spiritual benefactors might be angels or spiritual figures or
Mm.
our soul group or yeah.
Yeah.
So I think intuitively that's why I wanted to name that. And so in that personal like celebration I was just describing, it could be our higher self and then maybe like our spiritual benefactors or our committee, right?
Mm,
Whatever name we give to that, but that those who offer this unconditional support and
mm,
love, and making that a regular practice to um, remember that they are here with us and cheering
mm,
for us,
mm.
cheering for us.
And we're not alone.
No,
There's a lot around us, and if more people will remember that, I mean, my God, what a different world would we have, and people would just see that they are so much more than how they see themselves. And if we were to all see ourselves through the eyes of our higher beings, my God, we would really have a much different world. And the mental health scape would be a lot different when it comes to self-acceptance, and altering that box. Well, certainly appreciate all your insight. You're certainly a welcome guest at any time. I took in your every word. For my viewers who may be interested in following your work, or if possible, just touching base with you, where is the best place to follow your work, and to continue to maybe learn from some of your brilliant teachings?
I would say my Instagram is my name. So
Mm,
at Jona Genova, JONAGENOVA. And then if you're interested in the meditation practices, I would direct you to the name of them is Sustainable Compassion Training. And so
mm,
I think that website is sustainablecompassiontraining.org.
mm,
And you'll find some meditation groups that you can join through there with others who have been teachers in these practices for quite a while.
mm.
Um, I think those are two resources.
YouTube as well, I see, right? You have, yeah, a couple videos and a channel, right? So I'm sure
Yeah.
they could subscribe and follow you there. Well, a true honor having you on. We really want to thank you for your generous time, And please keep in touch. And I thank you so much for being here, my honored guest on the Wisdom of Jacob's Ladder here.
Thank you so much, Jacob. Thanks for all of the work that you put into this and your preparation in so many ways.
No, an honor. Thank you, Jona. Well, it was certainly an interview filled with a lot of wisdom, a lot of teachings, a lot of insights by Jona. I loved every moment of it, and I know many of you will too. So please make sure to watch this video time and time again, because there was a lot to unpack here, a lot of information, and it was really nice to see that a lot of these Eastern teachings are really utilized within the fast-paced Western world, and we're trying to find ways to use that within our society. So we thank you all for coming here on the Wisdom of Jacob's Ladder, and we'll see you here in the next week on my channel. Thank you for tuning in to just a wonderful conversation, filled with a lot of insight and a lot of tools, to really accelerate your life to new gears and tap into a greater reality at hand. Thank you. Let's stay in touch. Be well.